Hello and welcome to our October installment of Art History Illustrated. This is a recording meant to be used by people who were unable to make the live event, so I will try to make it as similar to the live event as I can. The title of this month's talk is Akhenaten, the Human Pharaoh. And I've added a question mark to that title since I first came up with it. I'll explain that as we go. So I am Associate Professor Brenda Edgar, and I am in the Fine Art Department at Jefferson Community and Technical College. And I teach art appreciation as well as art history courses. So we'll be focusing on the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled ancient Egypt in the 14th century BC. So this is during the 18th dynasty. And because his successors worked very hard to erase all trace of him from the earth, much of what remains from his reign has had to be pieced together from rubble. So you may be able to appreciate that the sculpture on the right there is fragmentary. The one on the left has fared very well, but that's pretty unusual for the art of his reign. So, questions we're going to address. Was Akhenaten a religious visionary, a Moses or Christ-like figure who created the world's first monotheistic religion while simultaneously elevating and adoring the divine feminine? Or was he an evil totalitarian who enslaved and molested children and forced his people to abandon their traditional ways against their will? Was he a normal-looking family man with a potbelly? Or was he an alien creature from another dimension? Was he diseased or deformed in some way? Did he really have both male and female physical characteristics? I'm showing you here two different depictions of Akhenaten, one of which shows us someone who looks fairly unremarkable. The other one shows, a very sort of freakish looking creature. Which one of these is the real Akhenaten? And that's what we're going to try to get to the bottom of, among other things. So will the real Akhenaten please stand up? We'll try to give him a chance to do that tonight. Let's go ahead and we'll come back to that, the so-called asexual colossus, on a later slide. Just a few words about where the idea for this talk came from. If you tuned into my previous series, which was called Art and Beyond, I had a talk about ancient propaganda. And I had a couple of slides about Akhenaten and the so-called Amarna period of his reign. And I pointed out in that talk how often we see these very warm, casual, intimate scenes of Akhenaten and his family. And it's interesting that he chose to have himself portrayed, behaving in a much more human way than any other pharaoh had. And I showed this piece, and we talked about, here's Akhenaten, here's Nefertiti. They have 3 of their 6 daughters with them, presumably because only 3 of them were alive at that time. Akhenaten is holding one of the baby girls and kissing her. Another one is sitting on Nefertiti's lap. This is Chief Queen Nefertiti. The 2 of them face each other, and their children are just kind of hanging out and climbing all over them. And this one is pulling on its mother's earring. And it's unprecedented for pharaohs to have themselves depicted this way. And one of the things I said in that talk was, and I'm quoting myself here, I said the curious thing about Akhenaten's new religion, and that's what he's most famous for, is creating this monotheistic tradition against the backdrop of traditional polytheistic Egyptian religion. So I said that I thought it was curious, this new religion, in a way, because now that he's saying there's only one God and he's not it, You know, that's kind of like a demotion for him, it seemed to me. He was choosing to say, I'm not a god, because there's only one God and I'm not it. But I do not agree with myself on that anymore. So we'll talk more about that as we go. I also said in that talk, Akhenaten's revolution required every Egyptian to completely rethink what Ma'at was, that is the cosmic balance, to ignore everything they'd ever believed was real. One wonders what percentage of the population, if any, genuinely believed in Akhenaten and Nefertiti's sun cult. I don't know that I can answer that still, but have some thoughts on it that we can talk about. So this is the stela of the royal family. It's today in Berlin. The distorted style, the way the human figures are shown in a very distorted way, distorted head shapes and body proportions, very harsh, weird looking profiles. This is called the extreme style, and we'll talk more about the extreme style, but it tells us that this piece is probably from early in Akhenaten's reign. And stelae like these were found in shrines to the royal family in larger private homes. So I think that tells us something. This piece did not come from Akhenaten's house or his tomb or his palace or even a temple. It came from the home of one of his subjects, which I think is interesting. So we're going to go through the cast of characters first, just to make sure everybody's familiar with, who we're talking about, and then we'll sort of dig in a little bit deeper. Akhenaten's predecessors is where we'll start, with his parents. His parents were the Pharaoh Amenhotep III and his chief wife, T. Amenhotep III, whom I'll sometimes call A3, ruled for nearly 40 years, which is a really long time by ancient Egyptian standards, and he was a prolific builder. A3 also had a strong interest in the solar cult, and both of those aspects of his character would greatly influence Akhenaten. Just wanted to point out quickly a couple of pictures, images of A3 and Queen T. On the right is a very, very traditional colossal statue of the husband and wife. You can see one of their daughters there on a much smaller scale. And then there's these depictions over here. On top, these are two different statues of A3. And from this period, he has a very distinctive kind of way that his face is shown. And then if you look at these bottom images from later in their reign, look how they're shown so differently now. This on the left at the bottom is A3, and next to him is the head of Queen T. And they both kind of have the same face in that later part of their reign. And they become kind of pudgy and cherubic looking. And I'm pointing this out just so you can see, Egypt is known for its continuity, but it was not unprecedented to have changes in style within, a single reign. A little bit more on Queen T. Her parents, so Akhenaten's maternal grandparents, were called Yuya and Tujuyu, and they were from Akhmim, which was in the south of ancient Egypt. This is a sculpture of T, which is today in Berlin, as many of these Amarna pieces are, and it presents a very strong personality, a woman of great pride and dignity. She may have lived out her later years with her son in his capital, and she died in the 14th year of Akhenaten's reign. So A3 had been preparing his elder son, who would have been Thutmose V, to rule as his successor, but quote-unquote T5 died before this could happen. This is how Akhenaten himself became the heir to the throne of Egypt, because his older brother died. Before he changed it, his name was Amenhotep IV. But here is T5 on a lion-headed bier with the Ba, or human-headed soul bird, upon his mummified body. The piece is in Berlin today. So let's introduce Akhenaten and his immediate family. That's Akhenaten, of course, there on the left. And he was the son, as we've said, and successor of Amenhotep III. He is famous for introducing a radical new form of religion in which the Aten, that is, the disk of the sun, was the only god. He died of unknown causes in the 17th year of his reign. On the right, we see Nefertiti, who was Akhenaten's principal queen. It is possible she was also from Akhmim, just as Akhenaten's mom had been. She is last attested to as queen in Akhenaten's 16th regnal year, but it is likely that she ruled as pharaoh for a short time herself under the name Neferneferuaten, which we will come back to. Just wanted to show you another angle of that really beautiful, really famous sculpture of Nefertiti and tell you a little bit about its background. In 1912, a German excavation team led by Ludwig Borchardt ran into an extraordinary turn of luck because they found the villa of Thutmose. Thutmose was a very, very common name, so not the pharaoh, but Thutmose the sculptor, to the king at the time of Amarna's collapse. And the sculptor's workshop had clearly been abandoned hurriedly, and its former inhabitants had left behind over 20 prototype plaster casts, trial pieces, and finished and unfinished elements of larger monuments. And we'll see many of those pieces in this talk. By far the most famous piece recovered from Thutmose's workshop is this bust of Nefertiti, which is, like most of the other finds from that spot, today in Berlin, because it was found by a German excavation team. Egypt has demanded it back ever since it arrived in Germany. Hitler himself was asked to repatriate the piece, but he refused, saying, "I will never relinquish the head of the queen." A little bit more about Nefertiti, both beauty and badass. There are, of course, many statuettes of Nefertiti that emphasize the beauty of her face, and her body was also frequently depicted with clinging drapery, which revealed its enthralling contours, as on the left. On the other hand, there is at least one image of Nefertiti getting ready to hit a female enemy over the head with a blunt object, and it's there on the right. So clearly she was a complex and fascinating woman, and it has recently come to light that she was actually far more powerful than previously believed. So Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters. The oldest was Meritaten, and she had the title of king's daughter. She is associated with several monuments and was a significant court figure. It is possible she served in a consort-like role to her father late in his reign. She is also eventually depicted as being married to Smenkhare, Akhenaten's immediate successor as pharaoh. Then there's Meketaten, who was the second daughter. Not much is known about her, but that she died in Amarna and was buried in a side chamber of Akhenaten's tomb. Akhesenpaten, whose name would later be changed to Akhesenamun, was their third daughter, and she's the one who married King Tut. So Tut was born Tutankhaten, later changed his name to Tutankhamen, and she was his chief queen. It is possible that she also married the pharaoh Ai, who was Tut's immediate successor and served as his chief queen as well. The 3 youngest daughters left almost no trace on the record. Neferneferuaten Tashret, Neferneferura, and Setapenra, who probably did not outlive her father. At the right is a relief showing Akhenaten, Nefertiti behind him, Meritaten and Meketaten, so the eldest 2, worshiping the Aten, the sun disk. Kia was a secondary wife of Akhenaten. It was common practice for Pharaoh to marry as many women as possible. He maintained a harem, and Kia was someone who apparently rose to the top through that harem system. Where her name survives in the record, she is called by the unique title of greatly beloved wife. But something happened around regnal year 16, and her name and image were removed from many monuments in an attempt to eradicate all traces of her existence. So this relief was reworked for Meritaten, the eldest daughter, by making the head of the figure bigger and more egg-shaped, like an Akhenaten family member, and altering the wig. But we can still tell that it's Kia because of her earrings. They are her trademark, and they did not bother to change those. So after Akhenaten's death, the aftermath is what we're going to call the period after his death. It's a very confusing time, and the archaeological record is often unclear about exactly what the sequence of events was and who the players were. But we will go through a list of co-regents and successors of people who came after Akhenaten. The first of those was Smenkhare. He ruled briefly after Akhenaten's death, probably as a co-regent, either with Meritaten, the eldest daughter, or with Tutankhamun. He may have been Akhenaten's son from a secondary wife, or he was possibly his brother. He was married to Meritaten, again the eldest daughter, who served as his chief queen. And that is probably the two of them together in that painted relief. The second successor was Nefertiti, and she was a female ruler who had a brief reign around the end of Akhenaten's life. While it is technically possible that this ruler was Meritaten, most scholars agree that it was Nefertiti herself. Some of the evidence for that is seen here. Two unfinished stelae, both from the workshop of the sculptor, both in Berlin, and they both show both Akhenaten and Nefertiti wearing king's crowns. After Nefertiti, we have Tutankhamun. He was Akhenaten's son, either by Nefertiti or the minor wife Kia. He assumed the throne after Smenkhare and ruled for 9 years. He may have ruled with Nefertiti as co-regent for a while. His chief queen was his either sister or half-sister, Akhenaten, which of course was a common practice. That was a best practice in the royal family in ancient Egypt from the beginning, to the intermarriage within the family to keep the royal bloodline pure. That's also probably why they couldn't produce any children who survived infancy. So it was King Tut's reign that saw the restoration of the traditional religion. After Tut was a short-lived king, maybe a member of the extended family, and Akhenaten may have been his chief queen as well. And finally, Horemheb, a military officer who ruled as pharaoh after I. He ruled for over 20 years and began dismantling the buildings of Amarna, the city that Akhenaten built. So Horemheb's reign marks the end of the 18th dynasty. That, of course, is a relief of King Tut and Akhenaten from his golden throne. So let's go through Akhenaten's life, a little bit about his early years and the rise of the solar cult. Much of Akhenaten's childhood was probably spent at Thebes, the southern capital of Egypt, and Memphis, its northern capital. He was named for Amun, the patron god of Thebes. Remember, he was born with the name Amenhotep. His father, Amenhotep III, had been a good pharaoh, as pharaohs go, and a prolific builder, especially in Nubia and western Thebes. The highlight of Amenhotep III's reign had been his Jubilee festivals, which commemorated his 30th year of rule. Although ancient Egypt is known for its great stability, its longevity was due in part to its flexibility and fluidity. The Egyptians, like all people of faith, were comfortable with contradictions and multiple versions of myths. Changes had already been afoot in Egyptian religion. Amun, the Hidden One, the god of kingship, whose cult center was in Thebes, had first emerged in the Middle Kingdom as the patron god of the royal household. By Akhenaten's time, he had become the chief among the gods. Re, the greatest of the Egyptian solar gods, had his cult center at Heliopolis in the north. It was believed that he died each night and was reborn each dawn. The king had been referred to as the son of Re for some time, but important changes in his cult in the reigns preceding Akhenaten's had already begun. Re became more prominent over time, and other deities were assimilated into his solar cult. For example, Osiris became the nocturnal manifestation of the sun. Amenhotep III went so far as to take on a solar form. Also during his reign, the Aten, or sun disk, became a god in its own right for the first time. At his jubilee, A3 was celebrated as a divine manifestation of the dazzling Aten. All of this is to say that Akhenaten's religious reforms did not happen in a vacuum. So Akhenaten comes to power, probably when he was in his early teens. And I think a package is arriving. And for the first 4 years of his reign, he, as we've said, he was known as Amenhotep IV. So it's during this early period that he oversaw building projects in Nubia and Karnak, where he finished his father's third pylon of the Temple of Amun. And these monuments feature a range of gods in a traditional style, so this dates to before his religious revolution. The first sign of odd things to come was that Akhenaten had a jubilee, which is traditionally a 30-year regnal anniversary, early in his reign. He had many buildings erected in Karnak to celebrate this premature jubilee, and in the sculptures of those buildings, the only god shown is Aten, and only as a disk. Previously, the Aten had been shown as a falcon-headed man, but in the Karnak reliefs, he is shown as a simple disk with rays that end in blessing hands, and his name is reduced to just Aten. It was also around this time that Akhenaten changed his name. Akhenaten means one who is effective for the Aten. So that very key milestone, that transition, can be seen in these two relief sculptures from Karnak. One shows Amenhotep IV, the future Akhenaten, back to back with the traditional sun god, the falcon-headed man with a sun disk on his head. The other relief on the right shows us Amenhotep IV twice, sensing an altar to the Aten. And the disc itself is actually gone, but you can see those very characteristic rays that emanate from the Aten, and they always end in hands, blessing hands. So the Jubilee buildings, the premature Jubilee that Akhenaten had in Karnak, the key structures were the Jempa Aten, which had colossal statues of Akhenaten and with exaggerated androgynous features, and that's our next slide. This large picture here at the bottom is also from the Jempa Aten. It shows you how nearly all of Akhenaten's buildings were constructed with talatat, or these small blocks like the size of bricks. And he used those because they were easier to move around and they led to shorter building times. There was always a sense of urgency to everything that he built. Well, later on, whenever his successors tried to eradicate every trace of him, they knocked over his talatat buildings, and then they reused the talatats to make other stuff. So the only way we have any idea of what the Jempa Aten had in it was by taking these talatat out of sort of the infill from other later monuments and piecing them together like a big jigsaw puzzle to try to figure out what they originally depicted. So that's why it's so fragmentary. And the line drawing on the right comes from the Hut Ben, which is another one of his Jubilee buildings. And that entire building, it's, gone. In fact, I can't even really show you a picture of anything. I have to show you a reconstructed line drawing. But the Hut Ben showed the Aten only with Nefertiti and the daughters. So Akhenaten himself doesn't appear anywhere in that building. So royal women held a very important position in the Aten cult, to be sure. Here are some of the colossi, the colossal statues of Akhenaten, constructed early in his reign at Karnak. And they are probably the most shocking examples of the so-called extreme style of the early reign. And fragments survive from 35 colossi altogether. Most of them are in Cairo. And, you know, his appearance is odd, and it raises questions, and it makes people want to try to figure out why he looks that way. And I have read dozens of attempts to diagnose him with just, I mean, literally dozens of different conditions to help explain, you know, his very strange appearance in art. But most art historians understand that the exaggeration was meant to show immortality. The androgyny was meant to show fertility and prosperity. He didn't really look like that. Androgyny was not a novel idea in Egyptian religion. There was a traditional god, Hapi, god of the Nile, who has both male and female attributes, and for similar reasons. So the distortions in Amarna art are not meant to capture Akhenaten and his family's accurate physical appearance. More evidence of that. Here are two profile sculptures of Akhenaten. The one on the left is the extreme style, so that's early. The one on the right is the moderate, later style. So there's no compelling reason to think that Akhenaten looked like the left image rather than the right one. Same with Nefertiti. Both of these images are on talatats from Karnak. The one on top is from early in the reign, so extreme style. The one on the bottom is more moderate. And again, there is no reason to think that Nefertiti really had the profile that she has in the extreme image rather than the moderate one. And here's a sculpture depicting the sculptor Bak and his wife Taheri. Bak was the chief sculptor of Akhenaten during the early years of his reign. So this is the guy who was in charge of creating and promoting the extreme style. And the inscription here around the frame tells us that Bak was instructed by the king himself. By the time of this piece, presumably made as a stela for the couple's mortuary shrine, the extreme style had softened into something a little more moderate. At the temple of Amun at Karnak, Akhenaten placed an extraordinary stela which announced that all deities other than the Aten had ceased to exist. He redirected revenue from all other temples toward the cult of the Aten, angering multitudes of priests. Starting in regnal year 5, Akhenaten sent teams of workers to destroy names and images of traditional gods. They especially targeted Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. Their work was often sloppy and incomplete, but removing the images was Akhenaten's way of making God's cults inactive. So here at the Temple of Amun, you can see where one of the cartouches, which is a name, was chiseled out. And this is from the Temple of Luxor in southern Egypt. Again, up here, all of the names of traditional gods have been rather sloppily and hurriedly gouged away. So let's talk a little more about Atonism, this new religion that Akhenaten invented. The Aten is unique in Atonism, and there are no other gods. Akhenaten's relationship with the Aten is also unique. He is the only person who knows the god, and this is where I think I was wrong before. This religion is in no way a demotion for Pharaoh, is what I have come to understand. Because the only way anyone can access the Aten is by worshiping the king himself. Hymns to the Aten, found in several versions, carved in the tombs of Akhenaten's officials, reveal an omnipotent creator god who is concerned with love and beauty. The hymns are written in Akhenaten's voice, since he is the only one who can talk to the Aten. This little statuette here was once painted, and the stele that Akhenaten is holding there contained the names of the Aten as a record of the kings reciting his great hymn. It was found again in a private chapel in somebody's house in Amarna. his private devotional image. So here is an excerpt from the last part of the Great Hymn to the Aten, which was written during Akhenaten's reign. You are in my heart. There is no other who knows you, only your son, Akhenaten, whom you have taught your ways and your might. Those on earth come from your hand as you made them. When you have dawned, they live. When you set, they die. You yourself are lifetime. One lives by you. All eyes are on your beauty until you set. All labor ceases when you rest in the west. When you rise, you stir everyone for the king. Every leg is on the move since you founded the earth. You rouse them for your son who came from your body, the king who lives by Mot, the lord of the two lands, Nefertiti, sole one of Re, the son of Re who lives by Mot, the lord of crowns, Akhenaten, great in his lifetime, and the great queen whom he loves, the lady of the two lands, Nefertiti, living forever. The art of Atonism features intimacy and exaggeration. It's remarkable for the way the royal family is represented, with fluid and exaggerated forms, in intimate postures, even kissing and hugging. This is unparalleled in pharaonic art. The millennia-old Egyptian grid of proportions was also changed, resulting in elongated forms. A couple of scenes of this fluid intimacy. One features Akhenaten kissing one of his daughters. The other showing Akhenaten and Nefertiti interacting very sweetly with three of their daughters. And we've seen a similar image to that before. The daughters look like this. They've had head shapes like this in all of the pieces that we've seen, but when you see them close up and isolated and in 3D like this, it's rather odd. So there's an unfinished Amarna princess from the sculptor's workshop on the left, and a little statuette of a very young princess on the right. It's a part of a fresco of the royal family from the king's house, showing two of the princesses. It's very rare in ancient art to focus so much tender attention on children at all in their natural poses and interactions with one another. Couple more. Here's a relief fragment with a tender interaction between two Amarna princesses in complex poses. And on the right is an unfinished sculpture of a princess nibbling a roasted duck with her right hand while reaching for more goodies with her left. Both Akhenaten and Nefertiti were depicted with one human dimension that pharaohs did not typically associate themselves with, and that is aging. Here are two unfinished heads of Nefertiti from the sculptor's workshop. The one on the left shows a youthful Nefertiti, while the one on the right suggests that she has aged, with its suggestion of wrinkles. So eventually, Akhenaten, in the 5th year of his reign, announced his plan to build a new city called Akhenaten, or Horizon of the Aten, in the intact desert wilderness in Middle Egypt. Today, the city is called Tel el Amarna. Between regnal years 6 and 9, he shifted his entire court there. It is uncertain why he did this. Perhaps it was religious fervor, or perhaps it was to escape the traditional religious power structure that he had effectively destroyed. The system of Aten worship at Amarna revolved around daily maintenance of the god, and this was not new. What was new was that now there was only the one god, and it was the sun disk. So traditionally, cult statues of the god were the focal point of a temple or a shrine, but in Atonism there are no cult images, just the sun itself as it beats down on the open-air sanctuaries dedicated to it. Special festivals were held for the god that featured extreme luxury food offerings. These are a couple of the Amarna boundary stelae, And if we are to believe these enormous boundary stones that Akhenaten had placed around the edges of his new city, it was the Aten itself, or himself, who had chosen the spot because it had never been dedicated to another god. The stele also list the things that Akhenaten planned to build at Amarna: temples to the Aten, cult buildings for the royal women, and a royal burial ground, among other things. Akhenaten began by building palaces and temples, as well as a grand north-south processional avenue called the Royal Road. Numerous relief sculptures like this one from the tomb of a noble person in Amarna once showed Akhenaten and Nefertiti whizzing by on a golden chariot as they made their daily journey from south to north and back again. The figures themselves have been destroyed intentionally, and that happens later on. Chariots saw the peak of their use in the Amarna period. No fewer than 6 were found in King Tut's tomb. Royal women drove for the first time in Egyptian art during this period. The people of Amarna. So once the bare bones of the city were built, people flooded in from all over Egypt and beyond. Entire families and communities would have been uprooted when their landlords, who were the aristocratic officials, moved to Amarna. The houses were built in an organic arrangement, not in a grid, and little villages grew up around large noble homes. It has been estimated that the peak population of Amarna was around 50,000. The population was almost entirely composed of the people needed to sustain the royal family and its cult, and the people needed to sustain those people. In the desert east of Amarna, archaeologists have discovered the remains of a workman's village where the construction crews for Akhenaten's building projects, including the royal tomb complex, lived and were buried. The evidence suggests that these workers were well fed and happy. However, there seem to have been other sites where the workers were considerably less lucky. In a series of pit graves in the Amarna North Tomb Cemetery, workers were buried, and they are nearly all children. They were worked to the point of death and then buried several to a pit. These photos are from the 2017 excavation season. There were between 3,500 and 5,000 individuals in this cemetery. Nearly 75% of them were between the ages of 11 and 18. 25% of the children had arthritis, some as young as 6. Nearly a third of them had at least one broken bone, and most were compression or extension fractures of the spine, again in children as young as 6. So the evidence suggests that this population was performing heavy labor in hazardous conditions, and they may have been separated from their families in a group work situation. They seem to have labored in the limestone quarries, so a dark discovery for sure. The age of Atonism lasted less than 20 years. Akhenaten probably died in his 30s. The events of the end of his reign are very confusing for historians to sort out. During Tutankhamun's reign, King Tut closed down the city of Amarna and moved his capital back to Memphis. He restored the old gods and the old ways, bringing the grand vision of an unusual leader to an abrupt end. This jewel-like situla or ritual vessel, today at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, is made with faience, a vivid blue glaze. There is an obvious erasure. One of the cartouches, that of Pharaoh Akhenaten, has been chiseled out, disrupting the smooth blue finish. This is just one tiny piece of the damnatio memoriae that King Tut declared on his father. It was ordered that all Akhenaten's monuments, all his documents, all his inscriptions, even all instances of his name, be obliterated. His name does not appear on official Egyptian king lists compiled in later dynasties. So in an ironic twist, the king who had once ordered his goons to deface traditional Egyptian temples ended up the target of his son's goons just a generation later, and one wonders if any of those goons were the same guys. Just to finish up, a little where are they now? This is Amenhotep III, and he was originally buried in the Western Valley of the Kings, Tomb 22. The tomb is unique in that it has 2 subsidiary burial chambers for the pharaoh's wives, Ti, whom we met, and Sitamen, who was also his daughter. And at some point, A3 was moved from his tomb and hidden in a side chamber of KV 35 in the Valley of the Kings. And T herself was never interred there. T was probably originally buried in the Amarna royal tomb, but later moved to KV 35, probably during the reign of Tut, where she may be this so-called elder lady. So there are these three unidentified mummies in KV 35, and the one on the left here we think might be Queen T. Here's the three unidentified mummies from KV 35 again. So KV 35 was originally the tomb of Amenhotep II, so that would have been Akhenaten's granddad. But at some point later, it was used as a mummy cache. And A2 was found. When they found the tomb, he was still there in his original sarcophagus undisturbed. But all of these extra mummies were around him. So there were 15 mummies that were relocated to a side chamber of KV 35 during the Third Intermediate Period. Of those, 3 in the picture lack clear identification, and they have been endlessly assessed, tested, discussed, and analyzed. So the so-called elder lady on the far left was identified as Queen T in February 2010 via DNA testing. This has, however, been passionately refuted. In the middle is a prince, usually called a prince, identified by some as Webensenu, the son of Amenhotep II, whose canopic jars were found in the tomb, or Tutmos, the elder son of Amenhotep III and T. And on the right is the so-called younger lady, who has been alternately identified as Nefertiti or Kia or one of Akhenaten's other sister wives. An anonymous arm was found with her. Akhenaten was originally buried in the Amarna royal tomb and possibly relocated to Thebes during the reign of King Tut. He is often suggested to be the unidentified mummy in this tomb KV 55 in the Valley of the Kings. But forensic evidence suggests that that mummy died at too young an age to be Akhenaten. Others suggest that it is Smenkhare, but the question is far from settled. It appears that the tomb KV 55 was once occupied by multiple mummies. It is also clear that the tomb was re-entered at a later time. At that time, any additional hypothetical occupants of the tomb would have been removed and possibly ended up in the mummy cache in KV 35. There was only one mummy left in KV 55 when they found it. And that remaining mummy and some of the other artifacts were desecrated and abandoned. So whoever broke into the tomb seems to have thought that this mummy was Akhenaten's. Doesn't mean it is. But they thought it was, probably. The tomb is often referred to as the Amarna cache, given the mixed nature of its contents. If that mummy is Akhenaten, this is what he looked like. This is a forensic reconstruction of the KV 55 mummy. The mummy of King Tut, of course, was famously discovered by Howard Carter in 1922. To the right there, Tut's chariot collection, which we referred to earlier. Here is King Tut's mummy unwrapped before your eyes, plus a modern forensic reconstruction of his appearance based on computed tomography scans of his mummy. The current consensus is that he is more likely to have died of disease than of foul play. So Tut was buried with his great royal wife, whose name had been changed by that point to Akhenaten, and their 2 infant daughters. So there were these 2 little tiny mummies. One is a girl who was born at 5 to 6 months gestation, and the other is a girl that was born at or near full term. No names have been preserved for these children, but they represent the final generation of the 18th dynasty. Just a few words about perception. Of late, it is becoming fashionable to cast Akhenaten as a monstrous villain. And with evidence like the cemetery full of overworked children, one can certainly come up with evidence to support this characterization. It is a dark discovery, the implications of which it will take time to fully assess. How then do we make sense of the doting, cuddly family man we see in the visual record? If we are Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, we say, given what we are beginning to discern of the Amarna system, the likelihood is that this is how the king wished to be perceived, as far from the reality of dictatorship as possible, like the Führer patting his dog, Stalin with his reassuring pipe, the beatific Mao Zedong. However, it is difficult for this art historian to accept that Akhenaten was any worse than any other Egyptian pharaoh, all of whom presided over a system which included incest, pedophilia, and at times outright human sacrifice. At a recent lecture by Kara Cooney, an Egyptologist and expert in reused funerary objects, she recoiled with a shudder when she showed an image of Akhenaten kissing one of his daughters. When one considers the possibility of his questionable relationship with Nefertiti, his eldest daughter, Cooney said, it renders these images distasteful rather than sweet. Akhenaten seems to have become for some a kind of manifestation of evil. It isn't so much a difference of opinion as a difference in rhetoric among scholars that we need to cancel Akhenaten. But using modern sensibilities to understand ancient cultures is frankly bad history. You cannot condemn Akhenaten for being a product of his time. In the first dynasty, for example, all of a pharaoh's staff, along with any potential threats to his heir, would be ritually killed and buried along with him. That was a culturally agreed upon best practice for ensuring the stability of the cosmic order. The practice had been long abandoned by Akhenaten's time, and he did not revive it. He did a lot of revolutionary things, but inventing pharaonic incest was certainly not one of them. These behaviors were encoded into the system from the very beginning. Akhenaten's own father was buried with a secondary wife who was also his daughter, but we're not demonizing him. A more balanced view comes from historian Ronald Ridley, who argues that when all the evidence is considered, Akhenaten was not, in fact, a totalitarian dictator. He didn't fit the definition. He did not unite the Egyptian populace against a common enemy. And there were variations in Aten hymns that show a tolerance for inconsistencies and imperfections, as did the organic nature of city planning at Amarna. Totalitarians build grids. Not only that, but numerous pieces of evidence of traditional god worship among the people of Amarna suggest that they did not unreasonably fear draconian punishment for small sacrileges. There was, in fact, a new universalism in Atonism, as even foreigners were considered the children of the Aten. So Akhenaten seems to have been lax and distant as a ruler. He was not a pacifist. He did put down a Nubian rebellion. He was simply more complex than any attempt to explain him with a diagnosis or anachronistic labels. Seen here, this is a stele from a house in the main city of Amarna. It's evidence of the persistence of the worship of Taweret, the hippo, human, lion, crocodile goddess of childbirth during Akhenaten's reign. It's today in Cincinnati. So people obviously did not fear death or punishment for continuing to have these traditional religious rituals in their lives and in their homes, which is not something you would expect if dealing with a ruthless dictator. So that is the end, and I'm going to stop the recording now. Wish I could take questions, but impossible in this format. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you next time.